Well, greetings and thank you for joining us today for the next episode of EnergySource Innovation Stream. We're really excited to have a global audience here for a really vibrant conversation. I'm Landon Darrence. I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and I'm joined today by Calli Obern, Director of Public Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at Capture6, a company that is developing an exciting new technology to capture carbon from the atmosphere while generating co-benefits for water management systems. Capture6 uses briny water from desalination plants and other sources and water recovery plants as a solvent to capture CO2, which is then sequestered permanently. Obviously, climate modeling, as many of us know, consistently shows that we're going to need to implement carbon negative technologies to reach net zero and keep it alive by mid-century. And in that regards, Capture6 is playing a key role in our sustainable future. Calli is also a member of our most recent Women Leaders in Energy and Climate Fellowship, and we're excited to have her here along with Capture6 today. Before we jump in, I have a few reminders for our audience. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag AC Energy. We're on the record and currently live streaming on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We encourage you to share a post you hear today. There's the virtual audience. You, of course, can ask questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, I promise. If you're watching on other platforms like YouTube, unfortunately, we can't take your questions. With that said, I'd like to give the floor to Calli for her presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Landon, for such a great introduction and great overview. Can you all see my slides okay?
Looking good.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to join the EnergySource Innovation Stream with the Atlantic Council. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about deploying carbon removal at scale. Landon, that was really helpful framing to understand why we're doing this in the first place. So I will get into it and we can talk about some of the different components of this technology and what we're doing. So first of all, your frame was really great, Landon, of why are we doing this in the first place? So we know that first and foremost, we need to rapidly cut our emissions that we are putting into the atmosphere every day. But we also need to be removing billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere to be able to stabilize warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the latest UN report put us heading for overshoot. So heading for overshoot means we need even more removals to be able to get us back to a point of stability while we're rapidly reducing our emissions using clean energy technologies. So that's kind of why we're doing this today. It's not an either or, it's a both. So you may have heard different words out there. There's like carbon capture and direct air capture. These terms can be really confusing sometimes. So I want to give kind of a background overview of what these are and what these mean and how they work. So first and foremost, you may have heard carbon capture and storage, or CCS. So this is point source capture. So you're basically taking the CO2 from an industrial source like a cement factory or a power generation facility. You're preventing the CO2 from entering into the atmosphere. So this allows the facility to be net zero. So you're not reducing emissions from the atmosphere, but you're not adding anything else. On the other side, we have carbon dioxide removal, which is called CDR. So this is when you're intentionally taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So this usually excludes kind of the natural CO2 system uptake from, for example, trees that are naturally absorbing CO2. And this is really focused on net negative emissions. So one analogy that I find really useful is if you think about, we have a bathtub and where the water is coming in, that's the CO2. Point source is basically turning off the tap. So you're not adding any more water, but you're also not taking any water out. On the other hand, carbon removal is you're taking water out of the bathtub. So you're being able to reverse what we've done in the past. So what do we do at Capture6? Capture6 is a public benefit corporation based in the US and New Zealand. And we are focusing on delivering just and equitable carbon removal through direct air capture by creating new green jobs, by delivering different types of co-benefits, some of which Landon mentioned, especially on water, and renewing natural resources, again, kind of the water intersection. So we are developing this technology to be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere all over the world. And we are based in Berkeley, California, and we're just a little over a year old. So how do we do it? How do we remove CO2 from the atmosphere? So this is kind of one rendering of what a facility would look like. So these are large industrial facilities. And for us, our process is taking in a source of salt water. a source of air that has CO2 in it, and a source of renewable electricity. And so through this, we use a kind of chemical process, a chemistry kind of interaction to produce carbonates that store the CO2. So the CO2 essentially binds with the salt in that water and produces these solid, so you'll see on the right-hand side, these like solid mineralized carbonates. And so these carbonates can then be stored geologically, kind of in the deep subsurface, or used in different value-added products. So we use, because we're taking in the source of salt water, we're taking the salt out of the water, and this allows us to then output fresh water that can be used for things like agriculture, industrial use, or consumption. So it's kind of this really interesting nexus where, like, yes, we're dealing with CO2 as a waste product, but we're also dealing with salt water as a waste product and being able to output fresh water for additional use. So this is sort of kind of the nexus that we're operating at and thinking about how we address this, a problem that's as big as climate change. So we're working on removing CO2 from the atmosphere through our direct air capture technology, also helping with adaptation. So by helping with desalination and eliminating some of the reject brine from desal facilities that helps, produce additional freshwater resources. And then also by, using the source of renewable energy, you can encourage the development of additional renewable energy, which will then feed into the grid and help further decarbonization. So our process is also a little bit unique in that, we're taking in these sort of sources that I mentioned earlier. We're outputting the CO2 in the form of carbonates, the source of fresh water, and then we also have this like acid base that we output. So the acid is hydrochloric acid, and you may have heard of that. It's like the batteries that one time I accidentally cracked it open as a child. That is hydrochloric acid. And so you can take that HCl and use it for things like steel or mineral extraction or batteries. You can also split it into H2 and Cl2, which is green hydrogen and green chlorine. And so you can use these products for, using hydrogen to power, for example, like a cement or concrete facility, using chlorine for wastewater treatment. So you can feed that back into a desalination facility as well. So this is kind of like a unique approach in the direct air capture space that sort of Capture6 is sort of pursuing on our own of, creating these value-added products that are green hydrogen or green HCl, in addition to removing the CO2 and then producing this purified CO2 or H2O that can be used for consumption. So this is, I mentioned this before about this is such an interesting nexus to think about dealing with CO2 as a waste product, but also dealing with brine water as a waste product. So by putting the brine water from a desalination facility through our process, we could recover up to 70% of that water. So this water would have otherwise, this super salty water, would have been used to either just put back in the ocean, which can be really damaging to local ecosystems, or it would have been put in these large evaporation ponds. So then they're essentially evaporating the water to get to remove the salt. So neither one of these is an ideal scenario. So instead, we're diverting that brine, using it to remove CO2 and then returning additional water, which we think is a pretty cool solution. So where is this happening? So I am based in New York. We have a lot of our team based here in the US, in the UK, kind of around Europe. We also have a team in New Zealand that's leading our efforts there. But we're also, exploring these opportunities all over the world. There are obviously certain things that make that have kind of the necessary conditions to be able to have a carbon removal facility, for example, land or renewable electricity. But there's a lot of opportunities to be able to produce, have these facilities to remove CO2 and address this water insecurity problem that we're seeing, especially as climate change accelerates and threatens sources of fresh water. So we are exploring opportunities all over the world, and we'll hopefully have more news on some pilot facilities here in the future, which I would love to share when it's the time. And one thing that really drew me to Capture6 when I was looking at kind of the climate space is that we are using technologies that already exist in industry today. So we don't need to go and create our own special Capture6 technology. This allows us to be able to order the pieces that we need right now that are available, and also gets the price down. So you can get it down to $100 per ton today by using these technologies that already exist and by selling these value-added products that I mentioned before, like the green hydrochloric acid or green hydrogen. So one important piece of like getting any technology to scale is it needs to be affordable, especially when you're addressing something that's a public good like the atmosphere, because CO2 is evenly mixed. So we really need to have these technologies be scalable and be affordable. So how do we get there? The key piece is, I'm a policy person. We need market and policy incentives to be able to get us to this gigaton scale carbon removal and to remove literally billions of tons of CO2. So pretty excited about some of the roles of policy to be able to scale this technology. So I want to include kind of an overview of what's happening on policy, especially in the US. So under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we have kind of these renewed tax credits that are up to $180 per ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere through direct air capture. There's also 140 million at the Department of Energy for research and development, as well as you may have heard of these like direct air capture hubs. So a lot of people just submitted applications for those. So that's $3.5 billion to remove 1 million tons of CO2 per year. So this may seem small, like a drop in the bucket, but again, you need to be able to get these technologies to scale now so that we have them to be able to deploy by 2050. There's also kind of innovative approaches from both the private sector and government on advanced market commitments. So Frontier Fund dedicated almost $1 billion to procure carbon removal credits. And also the Department of Energy is working on developing a pilot procurement program for carbon removal credits in particular. There's also the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is sort of a crediting system that includes direct air capture. And then this is just for the US. Like there's lots of other conversations that are happening around the world to figure out how you can fit carbon removal into either voluntary or compliance markets. For example, the EU emissions trading system. So there's a lot more to come there, and making sure that these are also high quality, rigorous, durable, and permanent carbon removal. That will be really the center of what's driving the policy and the market landscape. So thank you so much for joining, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that you all might have. And thank you again for having me to the Atlantic Council.
Calli, what a fantastic presentation. Really appreciate this. I think just a reminder for those in the virtual audience, you can submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I'm going to jump right in, Calli. We have a great question from Matthew Park, and he's, I think, like myself, captivated by the regional applications, right? There's a lot of desalinization-dependent societies, as he points out, such as those in the Arabian Gulf. And I think if you could talk a little bit about the geographic differences, perhaps you have a really global footprint, and what this means for societies in that region, amongst others.
Excellent, and that's a great question, Matthew. So you're right that those, for example, in the Arabian Gulf, kind of in the MENA region, that there's already a lot of desalination. So in places like Israel, we can basically take our technology and either integrate it into existing desalination facilities or basically pipe over the brine to our facility and use that as an input. So there's a ton of synergies there, especially when you think about, the kind of the MENA region, like in the Gulf, that there's so much renewable capacity there, which we just don't have the same capacity in the US. We don't necessarily have it built out, or have the transmission necessary to be able to access, especially from stranded renewable energy assets. So we're not taking away from decarbonizing the grid. So I think you're completely right that region of the world makes a ton of sense to be able to, tap into these like natural resources like sun, and being able to help address some of the water insecurity and seeing that growing in the region as well.
So Calli, one thing from your presentation that seems to be resonating with the audience is the conversation about the value-added products that come from your process and their applications with every other heavy emitting industries, cement in particular. So Philip was just talking about how useful are carbonates, and can they actually make high-grade cement or build bridges, et cetera, et cetera. Can you expand on that and its application?
Yeah. Definitely. So I'm not a cement or a concrete expert. I have some good friends who are working on that. And from what I understand is that, if you make, for example, like calcium carbonate, you may have heard of that before. That's what like seashells are made out of. So it's limestone. Limestone, so the calcium carbonates are, what I've been told, too soft to use to make different types of materials. Like, for example, use it for a concrete input for bridges and buildings, that you could use it for that, but that you would essentially need more cement to be able to make that a viable product, which would end up, if you have more cement, that's more emissions. So you could end up actually creating kind of a concrete mixture that actually has a higher emissions intensity than if you didn't use the carbonate. So there's like, if you look at a lot of like food products have calcium carbonate in them. So there's a lot of like ways that you could use it. I think it's more of the balance between like, do you focus on this utilization pathway where you're taking the carbonates and, using them, like selling them into the market to then displace what might be more, environmentally extractive processes. Or if you take those and store them underground, because we need to be removing net negative, emissions from the atmosphere. So there's a lot of great people who are working on the cement space, and happy to point you in their direction, but sort of an ongoing, space for research.
No, that's really helpful. Your presentation was incredibly articulate about, I think, the feasibility and the vision for scaling, and it comes down to economics. So I think we should just take a moment and build on some of those elements. You've obviously listed important uses for the value-added products that are created for the process. And Kimberly's asking, have you looked at the net cost of the removal after the value of the byproducts is subtracted?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the total cost kind of varies a little bit depending on where you're building. For example, you mentioned, we have the tax credits in the US, so that makes it a lot more affordable in some ways. But at the same time, any type of permitting or building in the US is a lot more expensive. It takes a lot longer. Construction materials can be a lot more expensive. So it really depends on kind of the combination that you're going for and what kind of incentives you have and the markets that you have to be selling these byproducts into. So that really focuses us to look for those locations that can optimize for, yes, both the tax credits, but also are there other types of incentives, whether that's on the desalination side or on, the renewable electricity side, that would make it feasible for us to be there and hit that $100 cost per ton. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but it's a little bit specific based on each location. So happy to discuss offline as well.
No, I think it's great, Calli. I really appreciate those insights. For those of us that follow the energy conversation, it's obviously much more dynamic than just providing electrons or taking CO2 out of the environment. Now, there's this conversation about inclusivity, a just energy transition, and I want to drill this down to jobs. And if you could just talk to us about what this means for skilled workers, what the future looks like in terms of Capture6's outlook on issues affiliated with what this does for the jobs out there.
It's such a good question, Landon. So one thing that we're trying to figure out within the direct air capture space, and specifically for Capture6, is what are the exact skills that we need to be able to operate, to build and operate one of our facilities. We have a pretty good idea, but at the same time, we haven't built one of these yet. So we're not 100% sure on like the exact skill sets, which could change depending on kind of the integration with other technologies. So we've been talking to different labor groups. So for example, like the Blue Green Alliance, they're doing some really interesting work at this environmental and labor nexus, where you can really co-create with different, labor groups around the US to figure out where are workers that have a lot of these existing skills that could be applicable, and how do you create opportunities for those workers, especially from those that are maybe in the oil and gas sector, to be able to transition over to some of these more, climate tech and like clean energy solutions, and especially in a way that's like a durable, long-lasting job. Because I think one of the criticisms for a lot of clean energy jobs is that they're abundant, but they're not the same kind of jobs that you would get if you were working at a coal plant and have, that guaranteed kind of salary benefits that they would provide for communities. So I think that's kind of an open area that we need to figure out. And for example, in the US, the tax credits, the 45Q for direct air capture, they have some pretty specific requirements to make sure you're meeting prevailing wage requirements in the US, and also collaborating with labor unions to create apprenticeship and training programs. So I think both of those are like incredible opportunities and really lay out the groundwork for creating a like sustainable and equitable economic opportunity within this new sector as well.
Thanks, Calli. A couple of our audience members are bringing back the conversation. I think we talked a lot about tax credits and the economics here. When do you think that DAC will be, practical and economic, even without tax credits or those incentives? Are we creating an ecosystem here in the U.S. through the IRA and other incentives that will eventually build us to a future where they're not necessary anymore?
Yeah, that's the idea. idea. So I think, the tax credits are really instrumental to be able to scale these technologies, because otherwise, like, a lot of these companies or technologies or interest in this sector wouldn't necessarily exist, because again, like, who is paying for CO2 removal? So I think that they are practical in the short term, but I also see that in the long run, that I could see governments just directly procuring carbon removal, because these are billions of tons of emissions of CO2 that have been emitted over the past 100 plus years. So are we going to be able to go back in time and figure out who emitted those and who should be responsible at like a company or individual level? Like, probably not. So I think there is a big role to play on using the tax credits to get the cost down, to get the scale up, and then pair that with long-term company and government procurement of these credits. So I think tools like an emissions trading system can be really useful to have it be like an economic argument to addressing this. So I think like they will be practical and economical at some point, but right now it's really focusing on scaling.
So if I could ask another question related to policy, though, here in Washington, D.C., and I imagine quite a few C-suites across the country, permitting reform is a hot issue. And I'm kind of curious what permitting processes would look like for Capture6. Probably, I guess we'd have to look in the U.S. context, given your global footprint. But how does that apply, and what can be done to help make that a more efficient process?
It's a great question. I don't know if I have any great answers. I think one way that we're looking at being able to more rapidly deploy this is integrating either with existing kind of facilities and technologies, or focusing on brownfield sites. So if you're taking a former, like a site that used to have a coal plant on it, or maybe like a coal mine, being able to use those sites, like the permitting process is a little bit more straightforward. But at the same time, like, again, if you need the transmission, being able to build out transmission, that can be pretty lengthy. So I think that there's a great role to be played at both, the state level and at the federal level, to be able to, like, streamline some of these processes. For example, I mentioned, the 4 regional direct air capture hubs. Like, those are all going to go through a NEPA process. And if we've all heard of NEPA takes a really long time to go through this like environmental review. And not that we shouldn't have, rigorous environmental reviews, but if the focus is on being able to demonstrate these technologies at scale, we need to figure out how to streamline those to make sure we're, like, taking advantage of this opportunity, but also protecting the environment.
All right. Well, you've invigorated the audience, so we're getting some questions firing in. So I'm going to keep them coming. Here's a question from one of our teams viewing today. Does your approach to compressing and reusing CO2 offset the cost of capturing such diluted concentrations of CO2 from the atmosphere?
I'm not sure if I'm like fully understanding, but I think your question is maybe using like point sources of CO2 versus direct air capture. So you can do either one, right? You just need a source of CO2. So obviously taking diluted sources from the atmosphere is more passive. So there's a lower concentration of CO2. And at the same time, if you're taking CO2 directly from an industrial source, that could be more efficient. But then you also are thinking about kind of what are the long-term effects of doing that. So I think, there's going to be point source done on a lot of industrial facilities. We talked about cement earlier. So for example, on concrete, as we work on creating kind of green solutions to those. But I think, both are going to be used and both are necessary, so we can get those net negative, because the CCS won't get us to net negative necessarily.
So Calli, we've spent a lot of time talking about the context of desalination plants. You and I had a conversation where we were thinking about other applications much more broadly in terms of where this technology could be deployed. I want to ask for that general outlook in terms of where you see Capture6 growing in unique sectors maybe that we wouldn't be anticipating. And then I'm going to add this question from Benjamin, which I think is really fascinating, which is, are you even looking at creative solutions like adding DAC with indoor farming and slightly enriched CO2 environments that promote plant growth? So how creative can we get there? This is how I'm going to translate Benjamin's question. It isn't like the specificity of it, but as how creative can this application be used as you pursue growth for your company?
Excellent questions. I think, looking at a geographic and kind of sectoral approach, like these, we didn't even realize this kind of water intersection until pretty recently. So like there are always new ideas and solutions and other different types of carbon removal solutions that are out there. So, integrating CO2 with farming, like yes, like I don't know if someone's already looking at that, but we should look at that and see if there might be a bigger nexus there, maybe between agriculture and direct air capture. There's things kind of intersection with direct air capture and again, like concrete production. So there's all these kind of areas where it doesn't need to just be siloed to carbon removal. And I think that's what we realized with the water sector from seeing this pairing with desalination. We're like, we don't need to just do carbon removal and isolation, but we can actually use kind of the economics to be able to scale this as an environmental and climate tool. So I think there's always room for ideas and creativity, and would love to hear more about the kind of farming and CO2 integration.
Oh, I love it. I think just making the case, about carbon removal in general, a lot of policymakers have an above, all of the above kind of energy approach. But when it comes to carbon policy, maybe it's a little bit more nuanced. So, as we're getting close to wrapping up today, maybe take one or two more questions from the audience. How would you, in that process, how would you make the case for carbon removal support to an energy policymaker that's taking this whole of sectoral approach?
Yeah, great question. I would, bring us back to not just the UN report to say like this is something that we need. Like we're not happy with the climate that's outside. I was talking to someone about like it hasn't snowed in New York, like that's not normal. So like from an environmental perspective, from an energy perspective, like this doesn't need to just be sunk cost. I think we've demonstrated that this could be a huge economic opportunity and a way to be able to, both encourage additional renewable energy deployment and also have an off-taker for some of those resources while creating additional jobs and delivering things like, fresh water to communities. So I think that like from that perspective, like carbon removal can achieve so many things at once that aren't just siloed to the carbon removal management policy space or just to the energy space or just to the water space. Like it could really be a cross-cutting tool that policymakers could use to, especially thinking about elected officials, these can bring a lot of benefits to your communities if communities are interested in having them. So I think it's definitely something to explore, and not just in a silo, but really as a tool that we have, one of many, to be able to address this problem.
I want to go back to the prior conversation too, and I really think it's important to see the wholeness of the application for Capture6 technologies. Just thinking about additionality for ocean and coastal siting, the environmental impacts. We're talking a lot about the carbon aspects of this, but do you have a lot of thoughts about the broader ecosystem and how this interacts positively for the future?
From like an ocean permitting kind of
from
standpoint,
ocean permitting.
Yeah. So I think, by diverting the brine, like that's kind of helping address some of these local, ocean ecosystem issues. And then we're also, we have an incredible research team, and they're working on exploring how these carbonates could be used for to offset acidification in the ocean. So this is very much like a research pathway that really needs to be tested at scale, in like a small setting, and then increasingly from there to figure out if it's a viable pathway before you go and like disrupt any type of ocean ecosystem. So I think there's an incredible like synergy there. A lot of companies are kind of working at this ocean space, and it's a little bit more delicate than taking CO2 straight out of the atmosphere. But I think we've seen from like the broader carbon removal community, especially with the ocean side, to be really cognizant and really intentional about how you're approaching dealing with like the oceans, which are really important for a lot of different communities. So when you're thinking about, taking any type of solution and deploying it, really understanding what the potential benefits are, but also what the risks are before you just go and deploy.
Calli, we've covered a lot of ground, and we've run through the 30 minutes relatively quickly here. I can tell you from the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council, we're super excited to see what Capture6 is doing, and want to provide you a last word to this audience before we wrap for the day. And of course, we'll be continuing to watch Capture6's successes as you move forward as well.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to join you all. I appreciate all of these incredible questions. I think it just shows how much carbon removal has moved from kind of this sideline into being considered one of these actual tools that we have and that we need to deploy to be able to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So look forward to chatting with you all further, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, and we appreciate the audience tuning in today. Thank you to Calli and Capture6 for your time. I just want to take one last moment to note the people that helped pull this event together. So Amaya Haddap, Lizzie Bowen, Rebecca Meacham-Nance, definitely appreciate your help and support in this as well. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on Capture6 moving forward. And for those that want to rewatch this event, there is a cached replay that will be available on the Atlantic Council Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter pages. We encourage you to share with colleagues, talk about the great work that Capture6 is engaged in. And we look forward to you all joining us next time for our next EnergySource Innovation stream. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Landon. Take care.
Bye, Calli.